You're watching the Urban Debate on Mirror Now. I'm Faye. Thank you for joining us. Today is the 26th of November. It marks the 10th anniversary of the terror attacks in Mumbai, but it is also India's 69th Constitution Day. Now, this was the day in the year 1949 when the Constituent Assembly, with long, loud, prolonged cheer and thumping of desks, greeted the passing of the Constitution. Now, headed by the architect of the Constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, 207 members of this assembly took 2 years, 11 months and 17 days to finalize the Constitution with its objectives and its principles and all of the other aspects in it, in the draft, before they finally reached a conclusion that was unanimous and they adopted it. Now, the Indian Constitution begins with a preamble. This preamble sort of embodies the source of the Constitution, or the power. The source of the power is us, the people of India. It reflects the fundamental values and philosophy, the ideals and the secular nature of India. And that's why it's really the base of everything we believe in this country. Now, we've all read it in school, and I think today we should read it again to remember the country that the architects had in mind. This is the country they hoped we would turn into. The preamble of the Constitution reads as such: "We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic and political, liberty of thought expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and opportunity, and to promote among all of them fraternity, ensuring a dignity of individual, the unity and integrity of our nation." These are words that should ring loud in our ears today. That should bring us to ask a very important question. While our Constitution defines how our country will function, what relationship the government will have with citizens, what relationship the central government will have with state governments, what relationship the legislature, executive and judiciary will have with each other, and what the place is of the citizen among all of this. Like Chief Justice of India, Ranjan Gogoi, said today, are we Indians existing in conditions of freedom, equality and dignity? Today we ask if we have truly lived up to the principles of our Constitution, or have there been members of our country, citizens who've been left behind, portions perhaps that we haven't fully honored. Is everybody truly free? Is everybody truly equal? Do we all have our rights? The panel we have put together this evening couldn't make me more proud. These are the brightest and the sharpest voices in the legal fraternity. There is no shouting. There is no government. There's no opposition. There's a group of people who care deeply about the Constitution and how it's being honored and implemented in our country. Joining me on the show this evening, with great pleasure, I welcome Soli Sarabji, former Attorney General of India, Biswajit Bhattacharya, former ASG, Sanjay Hegde, Senior Advocate with the Supreme Court, Siddharth Luthra, former ASG, and C.A. Sundaram, Senior Advocate with the Supreme Court as well. I welcome all of you. Gentlemen, thank you so much for giving us your time here on Mirror Now. My first question is to Mr. Soli Sarabji. Mr. Sarabji, good evening. Do you believe that all Indians at this point enjoy equality, or are there groups of people who are being left behind? The poor, the Dalits, the marginalized, the women, are there people who are being left behind, Mr. Sarabji?
No, but Faye, what's the exact question? What do you wanted to answer? Too general what you said.
Okay.
Be specific and ask me what about a particular part of the Constitution, so I can answer it.
Okay, I'll ask you a more specific question. We are, Mr. Sarabji, a country that believes to some extent, when we use the word socialist in our preamble, we believe that wealth should be distributed equally. We believe that the wealth of the country, whether it's natural resources or other wealth in the country, should reach as many people as possible. Now, over the last 5 years, reports tell us that the wealth has gotten further concentrated among 1% or 10% of the population. Are we following through on the idea of being a socialist country?
Faye, that's not the defect of the Constitution. It's the implementation which is defective. The Constitution actually is a very fine Constitution. It has fundamental rights. They are not absolute like the US Constitution. Fundamental rights can be restricted. Reasonable restrictions can be placed. There are directive principles. So all these things together, our Constitution is really, to my mind, a very fine Constitution. But in working it, in implementing it, of course, the executive can go wrong. And the instances you pointed out are those instances where possibly the executive has gone wrong. But that's not to blame the Constitution itself. It's the manner of implementing it.
Okay, I'm not, let me make this very clear. I'm not blaming the Constitution. We are actually examining, and this is a reality check, Mr. Sarabji, on the manner of implementation, on whether or not as citizens and as government we've done justice to the preamble and what was written down for us. The other thing, of course, that we must examine is the relationship between the three arms of government, of judiciary, executive and legislature. Have we done justice to that? Would you believe that in the last several years that those relationships have perhaps gotten a little difficult or a little bristly?
Well, you're right, Faye, but don't forget one important institution, the judiciary, which has really made the Constitution expansive and meaningful. The judiciary's role should not be overlooked, because there are many rights not explicitly defined in the Constitution, guaranteed by the Constitution, have been deduced by judicial interpretation. For example, the right to privacy. Now, so what I'm saying, trying to tell you is, it is really not the Constitution itself. I won't find any fault with the Constitution, the document. But as I said, the enforcement, the implementation of the promises made in the Constitution, in the preamble, they have not been done because the executive has gone wrong.
Yes.
And the judiciary is there to correct it. And it has.
Well, let me bring in the rest of my panel at this point. I also have Mr. Arima Sundaram. Mr. Sundaram, thank you for joining us. Obviously, one of the biggest, questions that have arisen, one of the arguments that's arisen in the last several years is over the word secular. The fact that it was introduced not at the time of the framing of the Constitution, but through an amendment later. There is an argument that perhaps we should examine whether or not it belongs there. What is your, what's your viewpoint on this? Do you believe that do you believe we're truly being a secular nation at this point?
Faye, there's always a great difference between the intent of the Constitution and how really it translates into actual usage over the years. As Mr. Sarabji said, our Constitution is a great Constitution. And as you pointed out, in many cases, in actual implementation, the various wings of the state have failed from time to time, and there's no doubt about it. Don't forget that even the judiciary gave us the famous judgment of ADM Jabalpur, which in effect really subrogated all the basic human fundamental rights to the state. So in implementation, we've had a lot of hiccups. So far as secular is concerned, I think addition of that word in the preamble through constitutional amendment was really nothing more than to reiterate that it is something which is vital to India. Don't forget that religious tolerance is already a part of the fundamental rights. Article 25 deals with that. And you find secularism in the Constitution from the very beginning. So there's no manner of doubt that our founding fathers did intend India to be secular. And remember, the beauty of secularism is not that all people should feel the same about various religious attitudes. The beauty of secularism is that each person, of whichever faith he is, should respect and allow a person of another faith to follow his own religion and his own faith. There again, we have a lot of quarrels now. We have a lot of cases coming up which in effect strike at the root of individuality of faith. And this is another very sad factor. But keeping all this in view, and keeping in view the fact that, as Mr. Sorabji pointed out, we have restricted fundamental rights, and especially because, as long ago Justice Krishnaiyer, in a famous case called Beam Singh Ji's case, said that even Article 14 and equality is subject to the overall public interest. And we have to look at the overall socialist public interest,
yes,
even in the case of Article 14, which guarantees you equality. So all in all, let's make one thing very clear. Our Constitution looks for the greatest happiness of the greatest number, the greatest good of the greatest number. And within that framework, tries to ensure individuality and freedoms to each person. Now, it's because of these two issues. One, we don't have a complete laissez-faire like many other countries do. We have socialism at the background, which means we have to look for the common good. And if the common good conflicts with an individual right, the individual right has traditionally in India been subjugated to the common good. So I would say that socialism is a great ideal, and it all depends on the government of the day, how well they implement socialism. But the powers to implement it is very
yes,
much there and
yes,
is found in the Constitution itself. So I would say, all said and done, we depend greatly on the executive of the day to ensure how well they can protect the Constitution and further it. And equally, we depend on the judiciary of the day to ensure that the executive is acting within the four corners of the Constitution. And there are cases, of course, where one always tries to interfere with the other. But jockeying for power between different wings of the state is not new. It's been done ever since times immemorial, not just in India, but in every country. So separation of powers is a very basic feature of our Constitution, and separation of powers is a very basic feature of democracy itself. And we have three different wings which have to respect each other. And to the extent that that's possible and that is implemented, I think I wouldn't have a pessimistic view. And I don't really think that we've come to a stage where we feel, look, we have let down the Constitution. I feel we are really at a stage where we should really be saying, look, we have a great Constitution, let's do better to subserve
let's do better. Fair enough. Mr.
I
Bhattacharya,
have great hope. I'm an
off
optimist.
late, and there have
I'm
been a
not a
couple of
pessimist.
judgments, forgive me, Mr. Suram. Mr. Bhattacharya, there have been a couple of judgments that have come out of the Supreme Court that have been questioned from a religious point of view. The firecracker judgment, for example, the judgment of Sabrimala, and a couple of others where there have been questions raised from some also powerful people who occupy office in this country saying, was it meant to be anti a certain group of people or pro a certain group of people? Is the Supreme Court being unfair to certain people? Does that hurt the fundamentals of what we believe in this country?
Well, I really don't think so. I would broadly agree with Mr. Ayaram Sundaram that the doctrine of separation of power is a basic feature of our Constitution. But this doctrine of separation of power is circumscribed by the theory of checks and balances. Now, as far as those specific cases which you have referred to, you see, in my view, India's judiciary is enormously powerful. But the power is not always ability to do things or the ability to deliver any judgment. Power sometimes is also inaction, self-imposed inaction, and it is that highest inaction which can transcend all other actions. So with the best of intentions, sometimes the judiciary may have trenched upon other areas meant for legislature and the executive. But what happens when Parliament frames law on political expediency and when executive displays scant respect to the fundamental rights? The judiciary cannot fold its hands in despair. The judiciary has to step in and basically interpret the law. You know, you have to appreciate one point. Even Parliament's lawmaking power is circumscribed by the provisions of the Constitution. Parliament, while framing law, whether it is violating the provisions of the Constitution or not, who is going to decide? It is the judiciary. So I, for one, am unable to subscribe to the view that judiciary is always trenching upon other, territories of legislature and executive. There has been absolute total failure on the part of executive at times. There has been a failure on the part of Parliament to rise to the occasion in terms of social legislations. When the disparity between haves and have-nots have been increasing by leaps and bounds, as Faye, you have just now stated, by quoting the figures. I think the latest figure shows that, 73% of the wealth is being cornered perhaps by only the 1% of the population. Some kind of a balance has to be struck, and this balance can be struck by judiciary and judiciary alone. You must remember that under Article 141, under Article 142, and under Article 144, when these three provisions are read in conjunction with each other, it is the judiciary and judiciary alone which can keep
Mr. Bhattacharya,
the
you
legislature
did
and
mention
within the constitutional bounds.
Forgive me for interrupting you. You did mention that when an executive displays scant respect for fundamental rights, the judiciary must step in. And this is now the question I'm going to take to the rest of the panel. Mr. Siddharth Luthra joins us right now. Good evening, Mr. Luthra. Do you believe there is a situation right now where the executive is showing or it has scant respect for fundamental rights, which is why the judiciary is having to step in?
I think the courts have stepped in. I agree with Mr. Bhattacharya. The courts always step in when there is a concern about citizens' fundamental rights. But I have a more fundamental concern which I want to raise, and that is the increased breach of the oath. Public officials, people who have taken an oath under the third schedule to the Constitution, they take an oath that they will uphold the Constitution. When they start attacking the judiciary and they start questioning the judgments of the courts, now that's a serious concern, because that shows that there are within our system people who take an oath on the Constitution on the one hand, yet are the same people who want to breach the rule of law. And that is something which is plaguing our society. Now, what does the court do in a situation like this? Does the court then rely upon contempt powers to try and enforce the rule of law, or does the court wait till a point where things reach a boil and only in those exceptional cases uses its extreme contempt power? Or should these not be matters for Parliament? Should these not be matters for government to realize that when we talk of separation of powers, there has also to be a healthy respect for the various institutions under the Constitution, and that, according to me, is what's plaguing the system. We can't expect the judiciary to cure all evils. Let me put it simply. If I have a right to water, if I have a right to clean air, who's going to provide that for me? You can't keep filing PIs in court and ask for it. This is the role of the government of the day.
Yes.
And till the governments of the day wake up and start giving us what we are entitled to, good governance, the court will step in, the court will monitor, the court will prod the government of the day, but the court can't override the government and tell them what to do, because eventually the government has to act. And
Yes.
this is across the board, and I'm not talking about today, but if you see the trend of the last few decades, this is the concern that we will have to deal with. An improvement in good governance is what the citizens demand, desire, and right is, and that has to be fulfilled. And that's not there. And that's the serious concern about how the Constitution has not been lived up to.
Absolutely. The fact that we look at or look to the courts to give us decisions on everything from whether or not we should be using firecrackers, right up to whether whether the CBI director should continue to hold his position, all of that expected to be decided by the Supreme Court. But Sanjay Hegde, this morning's newspapers, the front page of this morning's newspapers carried a worrying headline, and the headline said, and I'm just going to read it out: the Prime Minister has been quoted saying, "The Congress scares Supreme Court judges with impeachment to delay the Ayodhya case hearing." Is this an example, perhaps, of the worrying situation that the other members of the panel have brought up?
Well, authoritarian leaders the world over have always wanted to mold courts in their own color, as it were. Right now, you see in the United States, President Trump speaking about Obama judges and whatnot, and Chief Justice John Roberts, who was appointed by President Bush, telling President Trump that there are no Obama judges, there are no Bush judges, they're just judges under the Constitution. It so happens that people may be appointed under various regimes, but all judges and all men of law are committed to work this system of governance under the Constitution, keep the executive to constitutional bounds, and run a constitutional democracy. That is the sacred task that we undertake. When judges are identified on party lines or judges are sought to be painted in party colors, what suffers is the reputation of an independent judiciary, without which a modern constitutional democracy is not possible. I would respectfully disagree with the Prime Minister, and I do not think that he was right in saying that judges are threatened by X party or Y party. Both parties, when they have had absolute majorities, have sought to mold the judiciary in their own way. In the 1970s, we saw what Mrs. Gandhi and Mohan Kumaramangalam did with their calls for a committed judiciary. This government, when it came in, brought in the NJAC and sought to take over the judge-making power. The judiciary beat it back to some extent, but nevertheless, there is a very great scope for executive interference in judicial appointments. All along, the judiciary under the Constitution has been tasked with one thing: to be a sentinel on the qui vive. That is, be a soldier on the guard. If there is somebody who transgresses bounds, strike. But experience over the last 60, 70 years has shown us that the soldier sometimes nods, sometimes winks, sometimes lets things slide a bit. It may well be that as our democracy evolves, there will have to be a much greater enforcement of the discipline of the law. In the 1950s in the US, just let me complete this one thought. In the 1950s in the US, when desegregation happened, the southern states were against it. The United States Supreme Court then had to send the National Guard to enforce desegregation in Cooper versus Aaron. Maybe at some point of time in the history of this country, we may have a moment like that. But I hope it doesn't come to that.
We hope so too. Mr. RMS Sundaram, I want to take that same question to you. The quote on the front page of this morning's newspapers from the Prime Minister about the fact that Supreme Court judges are being scared into delaying the Ayodhya case hearing by politicians. Do you find that worrying?
No, I don't find it worrying because I know that the Supreme Court is too strong an institution. The judges of the Supreme Court themselves, as they often say, they have very broad shoulders and they can take all kinds of criticism. I see it more as typical political speech just before elections are on to try to go one party against the other party, where the attack of the Prime Minister was that the opposition is such that it will even try to pressurize the courts.
But is that healthy, Mr. Sundaram?
It was more a reflection on what the Prime Minister, it is not healthy at all to drag in the courts into it. I'm not for a second saying it's healthy to drag in the courts. But what I'm saying is that really I would see that as one political party blaming another political party for trying to suppress a judiciary. I don't see it as an attack that the judiciary itself is capable of being suppressed. And that's the way I'd like to see it, because I don't think the Prime Minister would, with the responsible position he has, have intended to say that the judiciary is capable of being suppressed and threatened like this. It appears to be more of a statement by him saying, look at the opposition, look to what extent they try to go. Because as far as I'm concerned, and I think my fellow panelists also, the one fact I think we all share in common today is that we all have a very, very high respect for the judiciary, for the judges who are doing their work. And I think almost every lawyer today will say that he's proud of his judiciary. And I do believe our judiciary has got too broad shoulders to get buckled in by any such threat of political interference. On the contrary, if you see recent judgments, they seem to militate totally against that. And in fact, the fundamental rights, which for various, over a period of time, have been subjugated by various constitutional amendments, by various other governmental attempts, have today really been brought up to a level where it's more protected than ever before. In fact, I find the recent judgments, both in the privacy case and in the NCT case, have both gone to the extent of trying to restore a fact that the fundamental rights themselves form a part of the basic feature of the Constitution. In which case, if it is the basic structure of the Constitution and Part 3 rights, the fundamental rights, then we go back to Kesavananda Bharati, who says that you can't tinker with it. So I think the courts are really coming a full circle around, possibly even going back to the Golaknath view. The Golaknath view, which was thereafter sought to be got away with by the 24th and 25th Amendments, really said that the fundamental rights are inviolable. In other words, they cannot be tampered at all, tinkered with by any constitutional amendment, cannot take away these fundamental rights. Now that's got to be watered down. But by the recent judgments, it once again seems to be brought to the extent that fundamental rights are a basic feature and hence, coming back to the same thing, cannot be watered down. So I think the judiciary today is very, very clear. The present view of the judiciary, recent judgments seem to be asserting that these individual rights are very precious rights which should be maintained. Of course, like I said, with the rider, the public good really supersedes everything else. And in some cases, individual rights will have to give way to the overall public good. And to that extent, the concept of socialism, as to whether in actual terms it's being implemented, all the wealth of the country is being cornered by a person or not. The concept of socialism, and when any legislation by the government in power is a step in aid of socialism, I believe the courts always uphold it and protect it.
Right. Mr. Soli Sorabji, here's my question to you. Right now, while we are having this conversation on the 9 p.m. prime time telecast, there are other channels that are having a conversation about what's happening in Ayodhya, about whether or not a temple ought to be built, about whether or not, Hindus should sort of flex their muscle and get the job done. Now, do you believe that the current political discourse or the quality of the conversation that's taking place in the country right now is threatening the fiber of a secular nation that we ought to be?
Yes, Faye, I think is deplorable, because the way political parties make statements, they don't seem to be aware of the basic principles of the Constitution. But the great redeeming hope is our judiciary. Our judiciary will not allow any fundamental rights to be abrogated or any changes being brought about in the Constitution which go against the basic features of the Constitution. And to that extent, I have full faith in the judiciary, but at times the judiciary has also failed, as in the case of ADM Jabalpur. But we deal with human institutions. We can't expect perfection. Perfection is not the attribute of ordinary mortals. But having regard to the entire situation and seeing the scene and learning from the past experience, I think our Constitution is in the safe hands of a judiciary which should be keen to enforce its basic features, to protect the fundamental rights of the people, and at the same time keeping in mind national interests. Of course, Sundaram rightly said public good, but who determines public good? Again, it's the judiciary which will determine public good. So ultimately, we have to repose our faith in some institution, and I would rather repose it in the judiciary than the parliamentarians and the executive.
Mr. Biswajit Bhattacharya, let's also talk about the word liberty. This is also a country where we are now considering banning certain types of food. Beef has been banned in several states and in most of the country. In fact, there are conversations where the fringe completely takes over, whether or not a film ought to be released, whether a book ought to be released. Let's also not forget the journalists who get shot down in our country. Is there a threat to liberty, the way it ought to be executed, the way it ought to be followed and upheld?
I am absolutely convinced that our Constitution, in no uncertain terms, do not allow sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism. Now, these kind of tendencies, particularly fanaticism and bigotry, giving rise to violence and hatred among each other, I think judiciary will have to come with a heavy hand. And I would entirely agree with my co-panelists, Sri Sorabji, Sri Ayaram Sundaram, etc., that our judiciary is the most respected institution, and somehow the legislature and executive, they have been unable to digest the fact that the judiciary is bestowed by the Constitution with an interpretative power and keep the other two wings of the government within constitutional bounds. Mr. Sanjay Hegde very illuminatingly quoted the example of how the US Chief Justice of India shot back at the Trump and then kept quiet. So therefore, these kind of situations where these people take law in their own hands. Recently, we have had some example of some lawmaker taking law in its own hands. And the Supreme Court, very, very in a statesman-like manner, showed power also means ability to refrain from doing. Supreme Court, by that judgment, very, very clearly indicated that yes, we can hit you, but we will not hit you. Let your political party take a decision against you. I don't want to go into the basics of which political party and why it came in the press, because I am not in politics, and this is no monopoly of any particular political party. The time has come, as you have stated, this kind of a sectarian approach giving rise to violence, the very social fiber of the country is being jeopardized, and the last bastion of India's hope is the judiciary. And the statement made by the Honorable Prime Minister about the Supreme Court, I think, with the greatest of respect, these are all political statements. But Supreme Court and judiciary do not take cognizance. They do not enter into any political thicket. So therefore, these statements are meant for politics. They are innocuous statements to basically garner votes. And before election, more such statements, if they are made, I will not be surprised.
Mr. Bhattacharya,
But
we
I'm
should,
sure
we should
our
not,
judiciary...
obviously the judiciary at this point, nobody's questioning the integrity of the judiciary. But in the minds of the larger population, or in the minds of all of the other Indians who are listening or picking up, and when a statement like this is made by the highest office in the country, is it disrespectful?
Well, this could have been avoided. These kind of statements to drag the judiciary and particularly the apex court, I think our political leadership, whichever party they may belong to, the sanctity of the institution must be maintained and respected. And I am personally quite disappointed that, but as my co-panelists have stated, the shoulders of the judiciary and Supreme Court are very broad. So these statements are best ignored.
Yes.
That's all.
Right. I have a question also now for Mr. Sorabji. Mr. Sorabji, if we look at the year we've had, 2018, it started off with a press conference that was held by Supreme Court judges. Never happened before. Everyone was surprised. After that, it went to an impeachment motion against the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. We've had issues with the RBI, we've had issues with the CBI, we've had issues with the CVC. All of the various agencies that should be functioning independent of government, independent of politics and any of its influence, have been questioned, brought under a cloud, and have perhaps had to assert their independence, which has happened in several cases. Is there a threat to our constitutional independence or to the principles that will keep our democracy democratic?
No, Faye, I don't think so. I don't think there's a real threat. At times it may happen, these principles are overlooked, and sometimes political parties, for political gains, make some statements. But remember, the judiciary, to my mind, is a safeguard of the fundamental rights and the civil liberties of the people. That's the real hope that every citizen has. And mind you, every citizen, though he complains of lost delays, expenses, everything, when it comes to a matter of public interest, they say, we want a Supreme Court judge to go into the question. Now, what I'm trying to tell you is, these things happen. Judiciary will take in its stride some matters, it sometimes doesn't do it, but on the whole, the judiciary is the real hope and the real safeguard of the fundamental rights of our people, and we should do everything to strengthen it. And I strongly resent any statements made to suggest any partiality in any judge or any threat of intimidation of any judge. I think such statements are totally useless, should never be made, because the judiciary in our country, I'm sure, will not be threatened, will not be even, what should I say, favored, maybe, will not in any way depart from its assigned role of upholding the Constitution. I have my faith in that, and I live by that faith.
I also want to bring up the question now for my panel, or the question of freedom of faith and worship. Now, we saw the Supreme Court exercise and talk about that freedom when it came to the judgment about Sabrimala, but let's talk about perhaps the other things that are happening in the country. The lynching on the name of the cow, the attacks that are happening on Dalits across the country. Do you see this as something that would perhaps bring into question our ability to provide freedom of worship to every single Indian? Mr. Siddharth Luthra, are we able as a country to really give everyone the freedom that the Constitution guarantees them?
I think we've not been successful in that area at all. As a citizen, irrespective of my religion, irrespective of my caste, irrespective of my gender, I should have the right and the confidence of going to any part of India at any point and knowing that the power of the state is there to protect me as a citizen. And in that, we have absolutely not succeeded. We have in fact failed. We have not been able to protect our citizens to the extent our citizens deserve protection. And that's a serious concern. Whether we take one element, and this is not a matter which is contemporaneous, over the last, I would say, 3-4 decades, if you see, instances of sectarian violence, incidents of violence on the grounds of caste, incidents of violence on grounds of religion, between rich and poor, rioting. This is become something which is happening, and yet we as a country, 70 years young, I would say, we who should have had a modern police force, an administration which had to abide by constitutional ideals, has not been able to live up that hope. And there is no point denying this real fact. We've done a lot, we've moved a lot away from what we were prior to 1947. But have we achieved what we had? And in my view, we've really not succeeded in that respect. There is a lot of introspection that needs to be done. But most important, and this is a matter of great concern for me, we've talked about the kind of statements that are made before elections. A lot of the earlier panelists have spoken about it. Now the tragedy is this what we are reducing our polity to? Is this what our political discourse is, attacking each other in the basis of terms? So therefore, the level of debate, Faye, is not just on these programs, when we meet, when we talk, when 4 eminent lawyers and myself, we are here, because I'll say they're the eminent ones. But the point is the level of discourse in society has to be raised. We can't have a point where not only on 9 o'clock shows, but on the streets, our leaders are shouting, one louder than the other, one raising the pitch in a manner more disturbing than the other. That's not what the founding fathers wanted us to do. That's not why we have the Constitution. That is not obeying, complying, and honoring the oath that they have taken on the Constitution to uphold the Constitution and its values. And that's a serious concern. And that's something which requires a change in the mindset from bottom upwards and top downwards. Because if you look outside the metros, do people have the kind of rule of law that they deserve? And I'll say one thing about this. I've spoken about this in the recent past. While the judiciary has done a great job, I believe, at least in the field of liberty, in terms of protecting the rights of the citizen, whether it be an accused, and even in victims, the courts have not done enough. In fact, there has been a steady dilution of standards in preserving the presumption of innocence, and that's a serious concern. Now, these are matters where introspection is required, not only by government, not only by parliamentarians, but also at the judicial level, as to whether we've diluted the safeguards, especially in the context of our Article 21 rights, where the procedure established by law was the only manner in which my liberty could be taken away. And yet, those procedures have been diluted.
Yes.
So there is a series of concerns, and I think it's time to flag them and highlight them for all of us.
Right, Mr. Sundaram, do you agree on that point that political discourse or the quality of conversation at this point has dropped so low that perhaps we all need to introspect? Because if it continues in this manner, even before we all vote as a country in the next general election, I shudder to think what the conversation will be like.
Of course, Faye, we should all introspect. Of course, we all believe that the political discourse, the level of political discourse has degenerated. That's all very well. But why are we forgetting the real issue? Why are we really, all of us, not talking about the real issue? Who does it really reflect on? If there's lynching, if there's intolerance, if there are people who are going on these great mobs and going and suppressing free speech, suppressing free thought, and trying to interfere with religious beliefs of others, who are we reflecting? We're talking about the citizen of India. If anyone has failed, it is the fact, after all, what are we talking about? It's that a group of citizens of India who feel they're a majority, they are the ones who go and suppress the others. They are the ones who go and lynch others. They are the ones who enforce the caste system. They are the ones who go there and prevent people from eating what they want. And they are the ones who say, I'm sorry, it'll be only my religion, my way, or no other highway. Now, that's the citizen of India. So I think the real question we should ask ourselves is, are the citizens of India living up to the constitution which our founding fathers gave us? It's one thing to say the government should take action. Action of what? To protect citizens against whom? The other citizens. And the saddest reflection of the day today, the worst part of it is that all that you have complained about, all that you have talked about, are actions done by Indian citizens against other Indian citizens. It's neither the judiciary nor the executive nor the
but isn't
legislature
that true of all
which
crime,
is doing
Mr.
it to the
Sundaram?
citizen. It is one citizen doing it to another. It's one citizen doing it to another.
I beg to disagree. With all due respect, Mr. Sundaram, that is true of all crime. And the reason why we have a constitution and we have laws and we have the judiciary and we have the executive and the legislature is to keep people from killing each other in the street, because that's anarchy. Are we closer to anarchy? Sanjay Hegde, do you want to rebut Mr. Sundaram's, do you want to offer a rebuttal?
Can I just answer this one thing alone, Faye?
All right, Mr. Sundaram, go ahead, please.
While I fully agree with you that the law must protect these people, let's also ask the people why they are throwing away secularism, socialism, everything else which is a preamble to the constitution. It's for the people. Why are the people not respecting it? And why
I may
are
have
the
an
people
explanation
bringing
for Mr.
themselves in a
Sundaram.
position that we have to say, yes, the state must protect them?
Okay, Mr. Hegde, please go ahead.
I may have an explanation. Just 1 second. See, my explanation is this. You know, we wrote this magnificent constitution against a backdrop of very great violence. People forget what happened in the 1940s. You had the World War, you had the Jewish Holocaust, you had the pain of partition, you had the assassination of the Mahatma. It was against these great acts of violence that the constitution was written, and our constitution makers said, these are the mistakes of the past, let us not repeat it. I sometimes fear that over the past 2 generations, we have forgotten that pain. We have forgotten those lessons of the past. And that is why, as Mr. Sundaram says, we have citizen against citizen going out and forgetting the constitution. And I must disagree with Mr. Sundaram on that theory of a greater collective good. Because when you emphasize the greater collective good against the individual right, what happens is that you also give way to majoritarianism. You think that what is good for the majority is good for everyone. Therefore, the majority takes upon itself to decide what it is that other people can eat, or who they can marry, or what they can talk about. It is in the protection of individual fundamental rights that the greater public good rests. When each individual citizen, a minority of one, is protected, that the whole country as one nation is protected. So each citizen, the great majority, must stand firmly for the individual.
Absolutely. In fact, that was, if I'm not mistaken, reiterated by the Supreme Court in the judgment of 377, where they said very clearly that the majority cannot overrule the constitutional rights of the minority, of the individual. The individual, even if there's just one, still has the same rights as the entire majority put together. Siddharth Luthra, do you agree, or do you have an opinion here to what Mr. Sundaram has said? At the end of the day, it is the people of the country who are sort of giving away the principles of the preamble? Or is it because the things that are being said, the things that are being done are emboldening the mobs to go out because they feel that they're being able to do it with impunity?
I believe that when our leadership makes statements to infuriate, to egg on mobs, they are going to go out and commit acts of violence. But at the same time, when we as citizens have entered into a social contract with the state where we owe allegiance to this country, as nationals of this country, we expect this nation to protect every individual. Therefore, as I said, it is also, we cannot say that the state is not duty bound, the functionaries of the state are not duty bound to ensure that the rule of law is upheld, that violence is not perpetrated on individuals of any class, sect, creed, or color. And that is what is the most important takeaway which we must take. The courts will balance rights. There is an issue as you talked about 377. So the courts balance rights. They said the rights of an individual must be preserved. Sanjay Hegde rightly said you can't have majoritarianism. At the same time, the courts will have to balance these rights. Today, there is a very serious challenge pending in the courts about cultural rights versus fundamental rights. Article 21 versus the citizens' cultural rights. That's before a constitution bench. But while the courts debate this, the extent state is the existing laws, the rule of law has to be preserved. And for that, while the citizen can cooperate in ensuring the rule of law, it is the authorities of the state that have to ensure compliance with the laws, as also compliance with judgments of the Supreme Court, not people going out and questioning the reasons why the High Court or the Supreme Court or any court has passed a judgment. That, I believe, is the worst attack on our democracy, and that has to stop. And that thinking has to come from within those who question these judgments, because these judgments are given without favor or ill will. They are given because justice in this country is blind and is seen to be blind, and courts decide dispassionately. And that is the concern, because if you want matters to be decided from your perspective, well, that's not what the Constitution says, that's not what the law says, that's not what the rule of law implies.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I've run out of time. I want to again thank all of my panelists for being generous with your time and with your thoughts this evening on Mirror Now. I do hope that we can reconvene this panel and continue this conversation, because while the conversation is respectful and we've all heard each other out and no one has spoken above anybody else, the audience, I'm sure, has also managed to learn and has appreciated the quality of the conversation and the discourse that we've had this evening. In conclusion, as a citizen who is perhaps this is a layperson point of view, we learnt this when we were in school. We learnt that we're a country that is secular, where everyone's allowed to follow whatever religion you may choose, and we have to learn to respect each other's religions and coexist peacefully. We learnt that we're a country that offers you freedom. Freedom to live, freedom to work, freedom to read what you like, eat what you like, watch what you like, be whomsoever you like to be. And now, freedom to love whomsoever you choose to love. We're a country that gives equality to every single citizen, whether or not that person is educated, whether or not that person is from a certain caste, whether or not that person is from a certain religion. They have freedom to believe, to live, to work, and to pray. We're a country that gives equality to all genders. Women are equal to men. Transgenders are equal to both women and men. And all of this stems from our Constitution. It's printed. You can read it. We can refer back to it on a daily basis to remind ourselves of the country that we should be. The dream of the people who fought for our independence. They imagined that this was the country they were building. We have to ask ourselves, is this the country we're building? Have we truly managed to hand out liberty, equality, and freedom to every single Indian? Or have we created a situation where we're constantly taking it away? If you're watching at home right now and you're going to ask me, but what can I do? I'm not a judge. I'm not in parliament. I'm not a police officer. I'll tell you what you can do. Constitutional rights also come with constitutional duties. Your most important duty as a citizen of this country is to vote, and to vote responsibly. I ask you today, I beg you today, 5 months before we vote as a country, to go online and check your voter ID. Make sure you're registered. If you're not, you have 5 months to set that right. Let's do our duty first. And if we do it responsibly enough, and if we take it responsibly, nobody else will be able to treat us like we don't matter, like our rights don't matter, like our constitution doesn't matter. Thanks for watching.